I had a project that I needed to work on in my car. We were making some modifications, and I knew it had to be done. I had a timeline, and I'd put it off for a while. And the reason was it was kind of unique, and I had never done something like this before, and I'm typically pretty I'm pretty comfortable taking on these kind of projects, but this one was a little beyond my skill set. So I reached out, as any of us would do, to a friend of mine who had better skills and better experience and better tools, and I said, "Hey, are you busy this weekend? Do you mind if I come over?" And he kind of knew what I was trying to do. He said, "Yeah, sure, come on over." As I headed out of the door, I told my wife, it'll probably be like 2 or 3 hours. In the back of my mind, I'm thinking, if I'm lucky, this will be 2 or 3 hours. I wasn't lucky. There were some problems along the way, some of which I created. And it ended up being more like 6 hours, at the end of which, we were exhausted. We were a little short of blood because we'd, busted up our knuckles and things like this. But it was a great time. But I realized, here's this friend of mine who basically gifted me an entire day of his weekend and his garage and his tools and knowledge and expertise and all these kinds of things. And I was profoundly grateful in that moment, because here's someone who didn't have to give me any of these things and yet freely gave them all to me. And so I responded, and I sent him a note, and I got him a special thank you gift, because I was driven by my sense of gratitude that I wanted to do something in response to this. Now, this is a season in this country where we talk a lot about being grateful, right? Thanksgiving is coming up in a few days. Any Thanksgiving fans? All right. You're starting to prepare the meals now and all these kinds of things. And so oftentimes in this season, we are reminded of the things for which we can and perhaps should be grateful. We've been doing this series called Make an Impact. And it occurs to me that there's a real strong connection between our ability to get our heads around gratitude and our ability for our lives to make an impact. And that's not maybe something that we have thought about or connected very often, but I want to do that in the time that we have here today, because I think this could be the key to actually unlocking the impact for your life, for my life, for all of our lives together. So to help us get started on this, I want to take you to a scene in Jesus' life with one particular individual whose story I think exemplifies why our lives can have impact when and if we finally come to grips with this thing called gratitude. So I'm going to start in Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 7, starting in verse 36. And here's the story that Luke records for us. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would know who's touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner." And Jesus answered him, "Simon, I have something to tell you." "Yes, teacher," he said. "Two people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii. A denarii was about a day's wage, right? So 500 days' wages, that's a lot. And the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more?" Simon replied, "Well, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven." "You have judged correctly," Jesus said. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little." Now, it's worth noting that the best scholars have come to realize that there's really nothing in this story that tells us much about the woman, particularly that tells her about what her sin was or what her vocation was. Nothing in there. We draw conclusions. Preachers sometimes draw conclusions. The rest of us will draw conclusions. But the story doesn't give us any indication whatsoever what the background of this woman was. What Luke seems to want to make sure that we understand is that her actions were driven by sheer gratitude. Gratitude for what Jesus had done for her. At some previous point before this story opens, maybe just hours before, maybe a couple of days, this woman had some kind of encounter with Jesus that prompted her actions. In that encounter, here's what we know: that Jesus saw her. He saw everything about her, including whatever shame or guilt or brokenness or regret or fears or reputation or habits or more that were a part of her story. He saw it all. And he gave her the gift of acceptance and love and forgiveness and a new life, a new hope, inclusion into his family. And so it seems that rather than speculating on what may or may not have been her particular sin, we would probably be better served by speculating on how you and I might respond in that same situation. Because just like Jesus encountered that woman and saw, Jesus encounters each of us. And he sees. He sees each of us, each of you, all of you, including whatever shame, guilt, brokenness, regrets, fears, reputation, habits, and more that are a part of your story. And while he sees all that, just like he did for this woman in this story, what he offers you and me and all of us is acceptance and love and forgiveness and freedom and life and hope and inclusion into his new family. And the question for us, what we need to wrestle with, is how in the world will we respond to that kind of generosity? For the woman in Luke's story, she responds with actions that are driven by her gratitude. And so here's what I want us to think about this morning. When we consider how do we have a life that has an impact, is it gratitude? Gratitude drives your impact. Because each person at some level wants to know that our life makes a difference, that it matters to somebody, somehow, somewhere. Throughout this series, we've looked at different ways that we can have an impact with our life through justice, through our words, through relationships. Last week, Pastor Katie was up here and talked about the different unique gifts that each one of us have and how we can make an impact in that way. But each of these has something in common in that they all require some kind of investment of resources. If we're going to make an impact, we're going to have to invest some resources. These things, words, relationships, justice, all this, it doesn't just magically happen. It's only when we are filled with gratitude that we begin to look for an appropriate way to respond. In the same way that I was filled with gratitude when my friend donated his time and energies and all that, when we're filled with gratitude, we begin to look for a way to respond, to invest some of our resources. Chances are, if you're not experiencing gratitude, you're not interested in parting with any of your resources. In fact, you may be more interested in accumulating them and holding on to them tightly for all kinds of reasons. So the question then becomes, well, if gratitude is what drives my impact and it requires resources, then what are those? And so I want to encourage us today to just take an inventory of your impact resources. Take an inventory of your impact resources. So some of you grew up in church world, and you might be familiar with something called the 3 T's. All right, so we're going to put pictures up here on the screen. See if you can help me out. So on the top left corner, what are we representing there? Time, okay, all right, a smart group, okay. What about the top right one? Talent, and the bottom is our treasures. There you see, those are the 3 T's. Like, I didn't make this up, I'm not that clever. Time, talent, and treasure. Those are the resources that you and I have been entrusted with. Resources that can be used to make an impact. Each of these 3 are gifts. Gifts. Things which, for some of us, we've realized, like, oh, you know what? I'm grateful for this gift, and I want to respond in some way. And you might be thinking, well, Pastor Mark, I don't know, like the treasure things, like I've worked really hard, and I went to school, and I put in overtime, and I went through some hard times with my company and all this stuff, and I actually worked for these. These were not a gift. And I would say, you probably did work really hard for those. Good for you. Where did you get the healthy body that allowed you to work those long hours and do all that? Where did you get the education opportunities that were handed to you as a child that opened the doors for you? Where did you get those network connections? And we start to realize that despite the fact we may have contributed in some way to some of these, that ultimately they're gifts. They're gifts. I like what Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 4. He says this, each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others. What kind of gifts is he talking about? Like, yeah, all of them. As faithful stewards of God's grace, and that word grace is the same root word as the gifts that he's talked about. It's charisma, right? In its various forms, all these different ways that God gives us. He says, you're stewards of this. In other words, God has said, I'm giving you this gift. What are you going to do with it? How are you going to invest this for impact? So last week, if you were here, and many of you were, Pastor Katie helped us understand the different unique talents that many of us have, right? We all have different ones. And each person who was here was given the opportunity on little Post-it notes to write down, hey, here's something that I think that God has given me, this gift, this ability, this whatever. And so we came up and we literally filled these front walls with Post-it notes, hundreds of them, things related to my head, my heart, my hands, ways that I could make a difference. And if you were here, you saw some of those things. Like that's the talents in a broad sense as one of these 3 T's. Today I want us to think about the other 2, namely time and treasures. We have a saying here in this country, time is money, right? We recognize the tight connection between these 2 things. We recognize that they are finite resources. They are extremely valuable. We guard them carefully, as we should. But in guarding them, sometimes we can forget they're gifts that were given to us. How will we respond? Will we have any gratitude? Will that gratitude drive our impact? Or will we miss out on the opportunity because we've forgotten that these are actually gifts? And it's further complicated, I think, for many of us because we live in a culture where we're conditioned to think individually. What can I do? Which isn't a bad question to ask, but sometimes it misses the bigger question. Because Jesus' mission wasn't about me as an individual or you as an individual. It was about us as a new community that he was forming, a new family that he was creating. And it's easy to take inventory for any of us and say, well, I have limited time and treasures and all that stuff. What can one person do? But that's missing the important point. And that is, don't underestimate what God can do through all of us. Like, we want our lives to have impact, but sometimes we miss the fact that part of that impact is going to happen together, collectively, right? And we can miss that. Once upon a time, there was an older woman, a widow actually, who had very little in terms of resources. In fact, life had been very difficult for her, and you wouldn't have blamed her for saying, you know what, I don't think my little tiny insignificant resource is going to make an impact for anybody. But this woman had experienced the faithfulness of God. We sang about this earlier. She knew that God had given her the gifts that she had. And so she responded with those gifts, realizing that maybe it won't make any difference at all. But the reality is that that woman's gift is actually still making an impact today. And so I want to take you back to this original story. It's found again in Luke's gospel, in Luke chapter 21. Starting in verse 1, as Jesus looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. Truly, I tell you, he said, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave gifts out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. And that woman's story and example continues to this day to have a ripple effect on the lives of countless followers of Jesus who are inspired and motivated to realize, like, oh, you know what? Her story prompts me to say, if she could do that, I can also do this. And so the cascading effect of that one small impact, one small gift, one small action continues to multiply the impact over and over, right? And we can forget that it's what happens together. It's easy to dismiss the individual efforts. I had the privilege a couple weeks ago, I was downstairs in our Hope Center during one of the pantries where we were feeding and providing food for people in our community who have food insecurity. And we reach about 1,500 unique family households a month with that. So I was down there. I wanted to check in on a friend of mine who sometimes volunteered, and he wasn't there. And so I struck up a conversation with another one of the volunteers I'd never met before. And he shared a little bit of his story with me. And he'd been out of work for a little while. After COVID, he had some health problems, and he wasn't able to continue in what had been a 20-year career for him. And so he found himself without income and ultimately without housing. And so here's a man who was literally living in a shelter down in Silver Spring and taking the bus to come up here to help provide food for people in our community who have food insecurity. And he kept reminding me, kept telling me over and over how grateful he was for the opportunity to come and actually serve in that way. And it just struck me, like, here's someone who understands what gifts are and is taking what he has and investing that and making an impact. And I suspect that his story will continue to multiply and impact others' lives as people hear about this one individual. Imagine an entire community of people stepping up together despite their relatively small or insignificant resources and working together. What kind of impact might that have? So I want you to take a look at this next video because this is a powerful example of what happens when people come together and take their seemingly insignificant contributions and begin to do something significant with impact. So take a look at this video.
He's catching all the legs.
James, clear. Right now, quick.
literally moving a barn just with individual effort, right? No one person could do that, no 20 or 30 or 100 of them, but coming together, imagine the impact, right? Like that's why it's important for us, don't underestimate what God can do through all of us. The challenge and the opportunity before us at Seneca Creek is to make an impact in our community, in our world, in our lifetime. That's the challenge before us. The resources to accomplish that are already here. God has already called his people and given us the resources to be able to make the kind of impact that Jesus had in mind for his body, his church. So this season, as our hearts are kind of turned toward this theme of gratitude, I want to challenge every one of us to consider with gratitude, how might I invest the resources God has entrusted to me? Not out of guilt. I mean, that's the other way you can actually get motivated to action, but I don't like that. Nobody likes to be motivated by guilt. Am I right? Yeah. I'd rather be motivated by gratitude and say, you know what, I want to do something because I understand what God has done and what God has given me. And so I want to challenge all of us to step out of our comfort zone and to be uncomfortably generous with our time and with our treasures in this coming season. Together, we can actually rise to the challenge before us. We can create impact in our community, in our world, like never before. So regarding time, I want you to think back, and many of you here were also here last weekend. And if you weren't, go back and watch the message that Pastor Katie did. And as you think about whatever it was that you wrote on that Post-it note, that unique contribution that you have, whether it's with your heart, your hands, your head, whether it's knowledge or skills or compassion, like think back for a moment on what those things were and ask yourself this: what was God saying to you in that moment? Because it was probably more than just put a Post-it note on the board. It was, here's something that perhaps you could use to make an impact. And so I would just challenge you, whatever that was, what is that next step for you? And it might take some time. It might take you getting out of your comfort zone, right? But to consider, how might I use those unique gifts over time to make an impact? And regarding treasures, and I've spoken about this many times here, I'm aware of the fact that people come with history and baggage and concerns and anxiety when people in church start talking about money. We don't get legalistic about this. We don't get manipulative. We just challenge people. Like, here's an opportunity. We've talked oftentimes about what I call the 1% solution, right? And the 1% solution simply says, you know what? What if, like, I can't make gigantic leaps. I'm overcommitted. I'm overextended. I'm in debt up to my ears or whatever, but I want to do something. And so I've challenged people, just take 1% of whatever you make and contribute that over the next year. 1%. And most of us realize, I could probably do that. And in a few years, by the way, when you start doing 1% a year, you suddenly realize, like, I'm actually being generous in ways that I never could have imagined. And I'm experiencing God's faithfulness to me. And I have talked with some of our largest donors here at Seneca Creek over the years, and to a person, they will all talk about how God has never failed to provide. I've never encountered someone who has practiced sacrificial giving to God's work, who has felt like God left them high and dry. It's never happened. So I thought it'd be interesting to just do a little math project here. You like math? Nobody likes math. Math isn't bad. Math is your friend. So think about this, right? Together. So we are right now in Gaithersburg, Maryland. And if you were to Google, like I did, and ask what is the median household income in Gaithersburg, what you would find is the median household income is $104,544. Now, for some of you, that number seems astronomical. You dream of making that much money. But understand, the median means there are as many people on the other side of that who look and say, yeah, I used to be able to live on that. I don't know how I did that, because now things have grown and everything's gotten more expensive. So people are all over the map. I understand that. But that's the median. How many households are at Seneca Creek? And every week there's different people here. Some folks are watching online. Some come once a week, once a month. Some come twice a month. There's people who show up randomly. So out of all the thousands of people literally on our database, I said, let's just conservatively say there's about 500 households. And if those 500 households in this community with an average median household income of $104,000, if they each just gave 1% more, and for some, it's 1% more than nothing, right? Because you just haven't figured out how to start. The combined impact of that for this church and the ministry that God is calling us to do would be over $522,000 in 1 year. $500,000 with 1%. Don't underestimate what God can do through our combined efforts of responding. The kind of impact that could be had in meeting the needs in our community is mind-boggling. And by the way, 1%, if you were average at $104,000 in your household, it's a whopping $20 a week. And most of us are like, oh, $20 a week. You can go on the giving app that we have. You can set up recurring giving. So every week it just comes out. You don't even see it. And I know people with history and baggage and don't trust churches, and I get that. There's all kinds of reasons for that. Some of you have shared your stories, and they're terrifying. And so we've said every time we talk about money in this church, like, our books are open. If you want to see our financials, we have nothing to hide. And if you are one of those people who just for whatever reason are like, I simply can't trust this church, I'd say, okay, then find an organization that's doing God's work in this world and invest there for impact. And there are plenty of organizations. I happen to think the local church is a phenomenal place to do that. And let me give you some reasons why I think so. Consider this. Where else can kids learn about faith in an age-appropriate way while their parents are finding resources to navigate the challenges of raising kids? Where else is that going to happen? Where else can married couples connect with others and learn how to build strong marriages over the long haul? Where else can retirees come together in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week, and celebrate God's goodness while supporting one another? Where else can young adults, often far from home and family, find community and purpose in a culture that has told them they're not enough? Where else can men come together and sit around tables and discuss together the challenges of manhood in a rapidly changing culture and find ways to meaningfully serve our community together? Where else can grieving family members come to find prayer and encouragement and support during dark days? Where else can individuals dealing with crisis find a support network that brings meals to their door, visitors to their hospital bed, and helpers to their immediate need? Where else can doubters come and find an open chair and honest conversations about life and faith? And where else can busy adults and kids come together to combine their efforts to feed and clothe the most vulnerable in our community? Where else can exhausted consumers who are tired of the materialistic rat trap find deep and abiding satisfaction from the need to buy more and more of products that promise but never deliver? Where else can the lonely and the immigrant and the stranger find family? And where else can the unemployed find meaningful networks and job training and even emergency financial assistance? Where else can the couple saddled with debt find a way forward toward financial peace? Where else can emerging leaders find coaching and opportunities to develop their God-given abilities? And where else can artists find an invitation to express themselves in glorious praise to the master artist? And where else can people of every nation, tribe, and tongue come together to demonstrate to all the world the beautiful tapestry and diversity and unity of God's creation as they form the body of Christ together in a world that insists that people be divided? Where else will those things happen? I challenge you. These examples and many more are the ways in which our resources together can make an enormous impact in this world. And you would be hard-pressed to find a better place to invest your resources in order to maximize your impact. Many of you sitting in this room and watching online, you have already experienced this kind of impact in your own lives, in your own families. And I just want to challenge you, each of you, each of us, to increase that impact as we respond to God's incredible gifts. Allow your gratitude to drive your impact. Be a part of what God is doing in this world, in this community, in this season. What will you do this week, this season, to make an impact with your resources? I promise you 2 things. God will take you out of your comfort zone. That's where he does his best work. And God will do exceeding abundantly more than you could ask or imagine. You will not be disappointed. And I just want to mention this as we wrap up. Some of you in this room, some of you watching online, are in a situation right now where you don't know how you're going to pay for your groceries this week, or put gas in the car to get to work, or pay for your prescriptions, or keep the lights from being turned off. And if you're in that situation and this is your church home, I want you to know that we have resources to help you. We have a grace fund that is specifically designed to help meet emergency financial needs of people in this community. And if that's your situation, please let us know. Stop by Connection Point, pick up a Grace Fund application, reach out to us if you're watching online. We are able and want to help you as well as together we come together and figure out how do we maximize our impact with the resources that God has entrusted to us. Will you pray with me? Heavenly Father, this is our season of Thanksgiving. And God, we have so much to be thankful for. Despite the challenges that many in this room are facing, God, you have given us a new day. You've given us new life. You've given us a community of followers of Jesus where we can grow and experience and learn together. And God, for all the problems and history of this country, it is an opportunity for all of us to walk in faith and to learn what it means to follow Jesus in a place where there are more freedoms than most people in this world can acknowledge. And so, God, we want to give you thanks. And we want to respond with gratitude to the resources you have entrusted to us. Not just as individuals, God, but as your church, as Seneca Creek, here in 2024. Help us do that, God. Give us the wisdom and the courage to step out and to invest in ways that you are calling us to. We pray and ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, I want